Dallas, I don't feel too well.
This is episode 7 of Dictate, Dissect, and Discuss. Today we are reading the first part of The Assassinations of the 1960s as Deep Events by Peter Dale Scott. 1. I mean by deep events the traumatic and unexpected episodes that recur periodically in U.S. history and alter it, nearly always for the worse. These deep events can never be properly analyzed or understood because of an intelligence dimension which results in a socially imposed veil of silence, both in the government and in the mainstream media. The assassinations of the 1960s have brought upon a collective trauma to the United States. We have seen the shockwaves and after effects of such brutal damage. The death of cultural icons, presidents, politicians, and civil rights activists as people that were, in some way, counterculture artists to great change is nothing to laugh about. The reason we still feel the trauma from these deaths is because they left open wounds where they once stood. I'm not saying they were all amazing people, certainly not. But regardless, we must recognize that, in a way, the drug cartels, CIA, FBI, and Mafia have an interest in culling hope and maintaining power in the hands of the powerful men with guns and their agenda. Drugs keep wars going and keep people addicted to the hand that feeds them. Surveillance and the threat of violence keeps someone quiet and unwilling to fight back. In the mob, which acts as a secret society of shadowy men that kill according to their own arbitration, under the guise of an oath, all of them are interconnected. I began this analysis in 2006 by comparing the JFK assassination with 9/11. I drew attention to over a dozen similarities, of which today I will be focusing on only 4. 1. The remarkable and puzzling speed with which those in power identified what I call the designated culprits, Lee Harvey Oswald and the 19 alleged hijackers. 2. The self-incriminating trail allegedly left by the culprits themselves, such as the bundle that James Earl Ray is said to have conveniently left in a doorway on his way to his car. Oswald was said to have carried a flagrantly falsified draft card identifying himself with the name A.J. Hiddle, thus consolidating a link between himself and the Mannlicher Carcano, which had been ordered under that name. Even more spectacularly, Mohammed Atta was said to have left one rental car in the Boston airport filled with box cutters and other incriminating items. He then allegedly rented a second car and drove to Maine, where he packed bags with still more self-incriminating material. 3. The CIA's withholding of relevant information about the designated culprits from the FBI, thus leaving the culprits free to play their allotted roles in Dallas and later on 9/11. I will say more about this. 4. The role of drug trafficking in both JFK and 9/11, and indeed in virtually every major deep event since JFK, specifically including MLK, RFK, Watergate, the Letelier assassination, and Iran-Contra. We should look for some continuing and hostile force within our society to explain them, and not, as we have been encouraged, to blame them on external forces, such as either Castro in the case of Oswald or angry Middle Eastern Muslims in the case of 9/11. I want to suggest that this continuing force, though involving elements from the CIA and other intelligence agencies, should be sought primarily in the CIA's interface with mob elements, and in particular with what I have called the CIA's global drug connection. This is a summary of the content Scott wants us to focus on. These are the threads that are innervating the lines of murder Scott sees throughout the 60s. In this episode, we're going to focus on the first three and leave the fourth point for the second part of this text. You know the phrase, "Those who don't learn from their history are forced to repeat it"? That quote applies here. Underlying forces and machinations within the US, not outside it. Remember Parenti telling us not to look for too many outside nuances when looking at common threads? Well, this is a case of that happening. The CIA and other intelligence agencies have a vested interest in the narcotics trade. Taking money away from Afghanistan, a key enemy and the #1 producer of the opium plant in the world, is paramount. See the Golden Triangle. The CIA loves that area. They also need to have a foothold in gangster elements of the state, i.e. the mob. Countless members end up defecting to the FBI anyway. It's all one big circle. Oswald and Sirhan's alleged self-incriminating behavior at rifle ranges. 3. In the case of first Oswald and then Sirhan, the culprits are alleged to have made life easier for investigators by traveling to rifle ranges, in each case at least twice, and then impressing themselves indelibly in the memories of witnesses by aggressively drawing attention to their weapons. This is what Malcolm H. Price told the Warren Commission about Oswald at the Dallas rifle range. Quote, "The first time I saw this person was in September. I have heard that he couldn't drive, but he was driving that day. And he came down and inquired if there was anyone who could sight a telescope on a rifle, and I told him that I could. And he said, well, he had one that he had mounted and bore-sighted, but it hadn't been fired on a range. And he fired 3 shots and he scored bullseyes with all 3. A very tight pattern." End quote. For various reasons, the Warren report rejected this testimony. However, there was independent corroboration of Price's story. At least 5 other witnesses claimed to have seen Oswald at a rifle range. I have argued that this all was concatenated false testimony to support the early notion, later rejected, that Oswald had killed Kennedy with a gun he had used earlier in the Soviet Union. The more we believe that the Warren Commission was right to reject this testimony, the more the rejected story constitutes evidence of a conspiracy. This is all very convenient, don't you think? Oswald and Sirhan are so memorable among the hundreds of other patrons both ranges must have per day because they talk about hollow point bullets and have scopes on their rifles. Yeah, so do a bunch of other people. And Price even said that Oswald couldn't drive according to what he heard, but by chance, he was driving that day. The fact that the Warren Commission, remember them from last episode, threw out the testimonies they received about Oswald, even though it was corroborated by 5 people, is suspect. Scott theorizes instead that this was fabricated evidence compiled together to make Oswald out to be a communist sympathizer because he purchased and used the weapon in the Soviet Union. And as we know, communist sympathizer meant murderer. If we consider the reason why the testimonies were thrown out, we can see that they wouldn't align with the narrative presented by the Warren Commission, since he clearly looked to have shot and purchased a weapon on US soil. But even stranger, there are 5 separate testimonies that all seem to coincide and then fit together like a big puzzle. Even though, as Scott will mention in a bit, that the common consensus in modern day is that Oswald was impersonated at the gun range by someone, most likely aligned with an intelligence agency or the mob. Four. Repeatedly, Sirhan was said to have talked obsessively with fellow shooters about his use of high-velocity mini-mags for target shooting, the type of bullet whose casings were extracted from the gun he used at the Ambassador Hotel. As in the case of Oswald, there was an abundant, almost overdetermined corroboration for these claims. Sirhan's use of hollow-point high-velocity mini-mags, unusual for target practice as Sakoman pointed out, was important to establish that his bullets created Kennedy's wounds. Sirhan was being almost too obvious about his intentions. We have to assume he was an idiot to be so outspoken if this testimony is to be believed. As we'll see below, Sirhan was never seen with that revolver before the shooting, and for a guy who supposedly frequented shooting ranges in such an audacious manner, you would assume he would have brought that revolver to shoot with at some point. The amount of corroboration was staggering. Five. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald was impersonated at the rifle range, and Malcolm Price saw a resemblance when the commission staff showed him a picture of Jack Ruby's assistant Larry Crafford. William Marks identified Sirhan from a police mugshot, but described him as 20 to 30 years old, 6 foot to 6'2", and 215 to 225 pounds, with brown hair. This was at least 8 inches too tall, double Sirhan's weight, and the wrong hair color. Officer Harry Starr, the only other witness, provided the same description. 2 witnesses of Oswald at the rifle range were employees of the Great Southwest Corporation, the company which, after the assassination, provided Marina Oswald with first a suspicious manager and then an even more suspicious lawyer. I believe the consensus today is that the man married to Marina never visited a rifle range at all, but was impersonated. It is harder to draw the same conclusion about Sirhan because of his unambiguous testimony under oath at the trial that he did visit the San Gabriel rifle range on June 4th, and on June 1st or 2nd did purchase a box of mini-mags at the Lock, Stock, and Barrel. But Sirhan's self-incrimination at his trial cannot be taken at face value. For a subsequent examination of 38,000 empty shells from where he allegedly shot at the rifle range, never identified one that had been fired from Sirhan's revolver. On this matter, as on so many others, we have to deal with evidence that Sirhan was programmed to speak and behave in such a way as to make himself appear falsely to be a killer. In Oswald's case, people couldn't even identify him, and the Warren Commission straight up told the person who gave the initial testimony, Malcolm Price, owner of the range, that he mistook someone else for Oswald. And Sirhan's identifier? He couldn't even give an accurate description. Isn't it funny how both the people who were supposedly either police officers or people with first-hand accounts of the murders could not recognize them or give a good description, despite seeing them on multiple occasions? I mean, the person that Malcolm Price mistook at the rifle range was the assistant of FBI informant Jack Ruby, the man who shot Oswald. In a later note, we'll speak on how the attorneys in the assassination cases would serve to run interference for dirty money. Further into the text, we'll see how hypnosis and suggestion, according to Scott, played a role in convincing Sirhan to assassinate Kennedy. Like I mentioned earlier, none, not one, of 38,000 shells Sirhan fired at the range he frequented were the rounds used in the revolver he killed Kennedy with. The accused and their attorneys, more self-incrimination. 6. Oswald, virtually everyone now agrees, was not a communist, yet there are multiple reports that, after he was arrested, he helped depict himself as a communist by asking for the well-known communist lawyer, John Abd, to represent him as his attorney. Analogously, James Earl Ray was not a racist, yet he strengthened the media depiction of himself as a racist by asking 2 notorious racist attorneys, Arthur J. Haynes Sr. and J.B. Stoner, to represent him. Ideologically, it's always beneficial to utilize communists as culprits for crimes because the public at this time was very overcome with nationalistic fervor and xenophobia against any Slavic people or Asians or even South Americans. Therefore, anyone who requests one of the classic commie lawyers is a communist by association, and therefore culpable by default because, of course, a communist with a gun from overseas that chose a communist lawyer would kill a man who represented the bastion of American freedom and democracy. It's that guilty by association fallacy. James Earl Ray got the same treatment. I wonder if anybody ever questioned that neither man, convicted of murder, could afford any other attorneys or that they were simply given to them for nefarious purposes. Remember the example above with Marina Oswald getting set up with a suspicious lawyer? Why would it be any different for her husband? I'm surprised nobody weaseled anything real or fake out of her. Seven. One striking common denominator between all three murders is that each case defendant were disastrously represented by lawyers who had previously represented mob figures. Recently, Ray's brother, John Larry Ray, has written that Ray was instructed to engage Haynes as his attorney. James Earl Ray himself, in testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the HSCA, and later in his book, Who Killed Martin Luther King, has indicated that his attorneys were chosen for him by others. Schofield was ousted from office after it was shown he had been bribed to dismiss charges against a corrupt Teamster official in Hoffa's camp. And by the way, Schofield, Ralston Schofield, was an ousted criminal judge who had interceded on Ray's behalf by asking attorney Robert Hill to represent him. Persons around Jimmy Hoffa figure into James's case more than once. Jimmy Hoffa's lawyer, Z.T. Osborne, would end up committing suicide after he agreed to represent my brother James. How did James make Osborne's acquaintance, and who would send my brother Jerry to ask for Osborne's assistance? By the way, this is John Larry Ray writing. It was none other than St. Louis Steam Fitters Local Union 562 boss, Larry Collinan, right-hand man to St. Louis crime figure Frank Buster Wortman, who is close to Hoffa's attorney Morris Schenker, one of the mob's leading lawyers in the U.S. James Earl Ray himself suggested to an HSCA investigator in 1977 that they look into all of these figures apart from Wortman. I guess this is why Shakespeare once wrote, "First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." John, Ray's brother, in a tell-all years later, said that his brother was put up to getting Haynes as his lawyer. One can only ponder over how the mob must have seen an opportunity to threaten Ray and stick him with a lawyer they knew would breed controversy. Anybody engaging with Jimmy Hoffa cannot be morally upright. Let's diverge away from Scott to claim that Ray did the killing of his own free will and intent. Then why would there be such a shady deal going on where he was forced to accept certain people as legal counsel? One, Robert Hill, recommended by a judge who was bribed by a man from Hoffa's crew. There must be some kind of internal nonsense going on. I can think of at least 10 reasons why the Mafia would want an influential black man making headlines to disappear. You can't tell me Hoffa didn't get to Osborne and bump him off so the whole trial would go as planned without a hitch. That whole melange of gangster union members seemed to orchestrate the whole family's entanglement from behind closed doors, luring them in with the promise of getting off scot-free. In reality, they could have been playing right into the CIA's hands, which is what I think Scott is implying with John Larry Ray's comments. Relevant allegations of hypnosis from unreliable narrators. 8. Indeed, given the general agreement that Sirhan was somehow programmed or hypnotized to become a Manchurian candidate, It is arresting that both Oswald and Ray also had men in their background alleged to be interested in hypnosis. One cannot discuss this feature without noting that the men making all these allegations were notoriously unreliable narrators. David Ferry, who had known Oswald when the latter was a teenager in the Civil Air Patrol, had studied hypnosis and practiced it on youths whom he knew. Ferry, an eccentric, was also said to be, quote, a bishop of the Orthodox Old Catholic Church of North America, end quote. Dr. William J. Bryan, who is some researchers' candidate to have been the man who hypnotized Sirhan, was also an ordained priest in the Old Roman Catholic Church. As it is pointed out in Truth at Last, a book by Ray's brother John Larry Ray, Kimball could have been referring to the CIA-assisted mind control experimentation of Dr. Irwin Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute behind McGill University. The existence of this experimentation was still a closely guarded secret in 1967. John Larry Ray links this Kimball interest in hypnosis to James Earl Ray's undoubted and repeated visits to two hypnotists in Los Angeles, Mark Freeman and Xavier von Koss. Does anyone remember when David Ferry was briefly mentioned in the last part? He died at almost the same time as Del Valle, that Cuban emigre and witness, did. His background was a childhood friend who knew hypnosis and is affiliated with a weird-sounding church isn't too striking, but when we pair it with a totally separate other coincidence that a person who hypnotized Sirhan also came from that same church and practiced hypnosis, it gets a little too suspicious. As if to add cosmic hilarity to this whole grave situation, Kimball, whom I forgot to highlight, was also a practitioner of hypnosis and worked with psychologists in academia, probably to further his skills, though his girlfriend later denies this. He was also involved with James Earl Ray. 3 separate assassins, 3 separate cases of tertiary parties who know hypnosis, or in the case of Sirhan, actually became hypnotized. Weird for sure. Scott even says above that Sirhan was an unreliable narrator at his trial because he was under subconscious suggestion at the time. Ray visited hypnosis therapists in LA, but I wouldn't discount him, if his affiliation with Kimball is true, to have gone to Canada or McGill to undergo testing. Nine. When a government tribunal simply suppresses a claim because it conflicts with a second and more dubious one, our interest in the original claim should be strengthened. And in this case, it appears that Salwin was correct. An FBI report on Kimball seems to indicate that Kimball was already in Montreal by July 1967. And now Scott will make a reference to the dubious private eye, Joseph Oster. Why do I say Oster was dubious? Because he had been part of the extensive effort to prevent Jimmy Hoffa from going to jail by harassing Ed Parton, Robert Kennedy's chief witness against Hoffa. Oster, in short, was not at arm's length from the intelligence mob realm which Kimball inhabited. Oster's later partner was Milton Kack, the former FBI agent who in 1963 wrote a pre-assassination report on Lee Harvey Oswald. I have noticed other veterans of behavior modification programs who became assassins. These include Mark David Chapman, the assassination of John Lennon. Chapman had been treated at Castle Memorial Hospital for clinical depression. Man, if I was on the tribunal to falsify evidence against these men, I would be sweating with the effort they have to go through. If the FBI has a record of a man who, like Kimball, just so happened to be at a Klan meeting, Ray was accused of being a racist. I still don't know how true this is, but I assume it has at least some credence if he met with Kimball there, or it would be a really great play on his part. And then left for Montreal, the place where Kimball had a girlfriend and a home. And all of this in 1967, only a year before MLK's assassination. The timeline matches up as well. And again, we see a mob connection in Joseph Oster. He once again is trying to shake down Parton on Hoffa's behalf, one of attorney Robert Kennedy's witnesses in Hoffa's misdeeds. Oster, by affiliation, was involved in gangster state activities and used his position as a private eye to give false information about Kimball's whereabouts, saying he did not go back to Montreal in 1967 until after Ray left, implying they did not meet. If the intelligence community knew of this, then sending a man who previously muddied the waters in an internal investigation into Hoffa would serve their interests well, making Kimball out to be a totally tangential party instead of someone Ray met with and probably got hypnotized by. And would you look at that, his late partner was none other than an FBI agent who wrote a report on Oswald. Mark David Chapman has also undergone medical care, and he too displayed sleeper agent activities. General features of the three major assassinations. 10. At first they were all quickly traced to mob figures. More recently, they have been traced to U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA. John Newman writes that, quote, someone in the CIA counterintelligence was harnessed to the JFK plot, end quote. In the case of MLK, Philip Melanson wrote that, quote, the trail of conspiracy leads to elements of the U.S. intelligence community, end quote. Shane O'Sullivan devotes an entire chapter to the intelligence connections of the RFK case, and another to his thesis that Sirhan was a Manchurian candidate, a programmed assassin of the type the CIA sought to develop in its program MK-Ultra. I find it funny how the mob and the CIA each think they have the other party firmly in their pocket, but in reality, both of them are using each other in tandem like symbiotic bacteria. Either way, they help to prop each other up, according to Scott. The mob acts as an armed insurgent wing that has interests that sometimes coincide with intelligence concerns. And the fact that a lot of people go into witness protection once escaping the mafia says something. They also have the drug trade in common, if we believe that they are distributing to the same people, and even the same foreign markets. I wouldn't be surprised if Scott at some point mentioned the Ndrangheta, cocaine trafficking, and linked them to some CIA outposts in southern Europe. We even see mention of MK-Ultra, which, up until now, was a big, ooh, scary government black ops thing, but now is starting to seem a little too real. The point is that all these authors who agree with Scott are trying to convey to us that we might have witnessed, in the flesh, some kind of programmed assassinations by candidates that have been put under duress or suggestion, or even wholly fabricated evidence from the intelligence community, mob, and drug cartels in order to keep the world safe for those who own it. Now, I kind of disparage the concept of a Manchurian candidate as pretty sci-fi, but of course, it's all speculation. (11) The three major U.S. assassinations of the 1960s also have drug trafficking in their background. In Deep Politics, I wrote about how Jack Ruby was identified in 1956 as the man in Dallas who gave the okay for a, quote, large narcotics setup operating between Mexico, Texas, and the East, end quote. James Earl Ray was said by some associates to have been interested in the sale of narcotics, while his traveling companion Charles Stein also had a narcotics background. The second gunman in the Martin Luther King assassination was hired and directed by a mafia-connected produce dealer named Frank Liberto, now deceased. A confessed participant in the plot, Lloyd Jowers, has said that his friend Liberto, quote, was into a variety of illegal drugs and activities, including gun running, drugs, prostitution, and gambling. Sirhan was a hired gun. Their chief evidence is the references in his extraordinary cryptic notebook to payments from a Frank Donnarumma, a convict dealing with racehorses who, in their words, quote, had a rap sheet showing arrests in New York and Miami, end quote. In the actual LA Police Department records on the Sirhan case, there is one page on Frank Donnarumma's saying, quote, security check with a MUS Carpenter through the California Racing Association shows that the subject has prior narcotic and petty larceny arrests in New York, end quote. Jack Ruby makes another appearance, this time as the arbiter of drugs in Dallas. As we know, the Texas-Mexico border is a big crossing gate for drugs. So Ruby, an FBI informant affiliate if we follow Scott's logic, was giving the okay for thousands of pounds of drugs to pass through the borders to Texas and the US. Now, who stands to make a profit from that? Yet again, James Earl Ray makes an appearance. Could he have profited from this trade? Though they seem to have previously been averse to such things because they were seen as low and dirty, the Mafia happily sells drugs if it means a profit. If the second gunman was hired by Liberto, who had an experience in drug running, the picture looks pretty clear. Finally, Sirhan, despite the evidence that he was both a Manchurian candidate and now involved with or had information on mobsters selling drugs, is apparently cogent enough to keep a very whack journal full of messages giving away the whole secret. I wonder if anyone has deciphered his notes thus far. Agentur Press, The King and Letelier Assassinations, and Operation Condor. 12. There are both intelligence and global drug connection aspects to James Earl Ray's 10-day visit to Lisbon in May 1968, shortly before his arrest. According to the HSCA, Ray thought that he might be able to make contact with a white mercenary military group in the Portuguese capital because of the colonial presence of Portugal in Angola. Clearly, he was aware that South Africa, Lisbon, and Brussels were the main points of contact for white mercenary activity in Africa. Agentur Press was a highly secret group which, according to an official Italian Senate report, was, quote, directly linked to the CIA and the Portuguese Secret Service that specialized in provocative operations, end quote. Years ago, I wrote about Agentur Press as part of a global CIA mafia narcotics connection, financed in large part by international drug trafficking. And this will be the final note for this episode. We will continue in part 2. The mention of a white military mercenary group in colonial Angola and Rhodesia, the latter of which is romanced as a place of colonial excellence by people on YouTube, no joke, is clearly meant to invoke the image of an extremist, unhinged man going from country to country on a mission to kill as many people of color as possible. Why else would this be included, and why else would Ray go to these places in order to be a mercenary? He knows there's both profit to be made and ideology to uphold, especially in Rhodesia. This image painted by the HSCA is meant to further implicate him as a racist, and in truth, I think he was or could have been racist to some degree. Either that or he just really wanted to kill people regardless of skin color. I don't know. However, we don't know why he wanted contact with this mercenary group in Lisbon, only that he wanted to talk to them. What we can guess, though, is that Ray had some kind of know-how on the intelligence spheres in these countries, especially since even finding Agentur Press must have been exceedingly difficult in the late 60s, where all he had was word of mouth and affiliates. If the organization was that secret, nothing would have been published, at least nothing a man like Ray, an ordinary citizen, could have accessed. And that's it for this episode. Next time in episode 8, we're going to cover part 2 of this text. See you next time!